Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 2021 Open Space Conference. My name is Kate Sutcliffe, and I'm one of the coordinators of this year's event. This is our 6th annual Open Space Conference, which is a conference dedicated to sharing knowledge between open space committees and others across our state involved in protecting and stewarding open space. We so appreciate each of you taking time out of your day to attend and be part of this conversation. Just by showing up today, you've already contributed to strengthening the preservation and stewardship of open space in Massachusetts, and we really appreciate you taking the time to do so. Before we get started with our speakers today, I just want to give a few acknowledgements and thank yous. First, just a huge thank you to the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation for funding this conference through the Working Forest initiatives. We also want to thank our partners at the University of Massachusetts Amherst Mass Woods, Mount Grace, Sudbury Valley Trustees, the Southeastern Massachusetts Pine Barren Alliance, and the Merrimack River Watershed Council for being part of this year's planning process. And finally, thank you as well to all of the open space committees across the state who have been sharing their expertise and their knowledge with us to put this conference together. We really appreciate it, and it would not have been possible to put on this event without you. Just a few housekeeping notes for today before we dive in. This webinar is being recorded. There will be a recording available after the conference, so you will be able to access it going forward and come back and rewatch it if you need to in the future. At the end of today, we will be sharing an evaluation with you. We would really appreciate it if you could take some time to fill it out, leave your feedback so that we can improve future sessions and get your input about what future topics would be helpful for you to learn about. And then you'll also find additional resources from today on the conference website. When you're there, make sure to check out our conference case studies, which feature the knowledge and expertise from open space committees across the state. Throughout the webinar today, if you would like to ask a question of our speakers, you can use the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen to ask a question. After all 3 of our speakers have gone today, we'll have a question and answer session with them, and we'll ask those questions live. You can also use the chat function as well to indicate if you're having any technical difficulties or if you need assistance at any point throughout the webinar. And with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. So our session today is focused on open space from planning to implementation. So our first speaker, Melissa Cryan, is the Grants Program Supervisor for the Division of Conservation Services, and she'll be talking about planning for open space through the Open Space and Recreation Plan process. Our second speaker, Rebecca Longval, will be talking about funding open space and how you can actually pay for conservation and stewardship projects. And then our third speaker, Christina Madsen, will be talking about implementing those projects. So what those look like when you actually are going forward to conserve space. And she'll be talking about her experience using right of first refusal to conserve local lands in her town of Southampton. So, I'm sorry. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Melissa. As I mentioned, Melissa is the Grants Program Supervisor at the Division of Conservation Services, where she oversees municipal and nonprofit open space and recreation grant programs. She is the go-to person in the state for everything related to open space and recreation plans, which is what she'll be talking about today. So Melissa, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Kate. And if all goes according to plan, I'm going to share my PowerPoint with all of you. Does that look good to everybody?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So thanks. I'm going to echo Kate's thanks for everyone for being here today. If we were all in a room together, I would ask who has been involved in a plan writing process before, but I can't. I'm going to still ask you that question, but I can't hear your response. So just say it in your head and I will mind meld with all of you and pretend like I can hear what you're saying back. So a couple of caveats about this presentation before I start. Number one being that, hey, I don't know if you've noticed that we're in the middle of a pandemic right now. So some of what we're talking about here is what we would be discussing if this was normal times when it comes to public participation and that sort of thing. So I'd prefer to not get too bogged down in questions about public participation in COVID times, although I am happy to answer some questions about that. And the other thing that I would like to just briefly mention is that we are working currently on an update to the Open Space and Recreation Planners Workbook. So these are the requirements as they stand right now. So just a couple of caveats before we get started. So what an open space and recreation plan is will not change in the future. So an OSRP is a document that describes a community's open space and recreation resources and is what we like to think of as a blueprint for action for open space and recreation decision makers in a community. And open space is what you think it is, but it also may be what you don't think it is. So most people, when you hear the term open space, I think it lends, your brain goes to conservation land, forested land in your community, maybe the farms that you drive past or go to the farm stands, that sort of thing, parks, things like that. But I think that I would like to ask you guys to broaden your horizons as to what it is that you're also thinking of, whether it could be for conservation or recreation property in the future. This could be a vacant lot, a brownfield that could be developed in the future into a community garden, a community town forest, that sort of thing. Most of the land that is open space is owned by an agency or organization that is dedicated to conservation or recreation, but please remember that not all open space is protected. Why would you bother writing an open space and recreation plan, especially for those of you that have been through the process? And maybe some of those of you who are just coming out of the process, you're like, yeah, why do I want to write an open space and recreation plan? It's such a big pain in the neck. It enables you to integrate many sources of data into one place. It helps to educate residents in your community about different conservation and recreation issues, such that when you then need support for a particular project at town meeting or at a city council vote, people are aware of that project and will maybe help pass a particular town meeting or city council town meeting article or pass a city council motion. It helps to identify actions that will protect and manage a community's resources. And as a planner, I love planning for planning's sake, but I'm also not dumb that people like a carrot and not just a stick. So the carrots are all of the grant programs that we offer at the Division of Conservation Services where I work. And at the end of the presentation, I'll briefly go over the different funding options that we have that when you have an up-to-date open space and recreation plan, you become eligible for. The OSRP requirements are in the workbook, which the very long, cumbersome link is listed right here. Currently, there are 9 sections of the plan, highlights of which are the open space inventory and the action plan. Get my cursor back. There we go. What is the process of writing an open space and recreation plan? First, you have to form a committee. The members can be local members of local boards, interested citizens, city or town staff. The lead author can be a volunteer, a municipal employee, a grad student, or sometimes a consultant. This is, I will tell you, the vast majority of plans are not written by consultants. So I just want to make sure everyone is aware of that, because I get many sad, depressed emails and phone calls about how their city or town is having to write their own plan and doesn't have the money for a consultant. And this is really the case for the vast majority of the plans that I review. So don't be sad or depressed. You have a lot of support throughout the Commonwealth when it comes to that. Many times the open space and recreation plan sections are divvied up. If you have an expert in soils, or you have an expert in somebody who loves doing GIS stuff, they can do the mapping. But what we always suggest is that if you need to take certain parts of the plan on as a team. So the public participation process being one of them, because that is a real undertaking and it needs to be very thorough. That should be something that everybody is helping with. So I get asked a lot of times, well, I'm just doing an update. So what I don't need to do as much, correct? And while that can be true, we do expect an open space and recreation plan update to have all of the 9 sections of the plan. But there are some sections that you may be able to copy and paste from your last plan into your new plan. There is currently an appendix in the workbook that tells you what has to be new, what can be new, and what you can just copy and paste from your last plan into the new one. For instance, I don't imagine your geology will have changed much in 7 years. Let's hope not. Let's hope you haven't had a major geological event in the past 7 years. But like I said, you need to do a public participation process for your plan. So that has to be redone. Your population may have changed, things like that. So we do expect a complete 9-section plan every single time. So like I said, some of the important components I want to delve into. This is the 30,000-foot PowerPoint presentation. I'm happy to meet with a community individually to get more into the weeds on the process. The public participation process, again, remember, this is no pandemic world we're talking about here. This is what would work best in your community. These are all suggestions. So I'm not saying that you have to do all of these things. You know what types of participation work best in your community. You can do surveys, you can do a public meeting, you can do a workshop, combine these sorts of things. A good creative idea I saw one time was that there was a photo contest to get some people who may not normally participate involved in the plan, which also had the side benefit of, hey, then you had photos all ready to go for your final plan, which was great. One of the things that we do require, however, is that you don't solely do an online only. So like you can't only do a SurveyMonkey survey, because not everybody has access to a computer, not everyone feels comfortable with a computer, that sort of thing. This survey, the public participation process, the point of it is to help gather information on what the community members feel is important to protect, what recreational amenities that they'd like to see, this sort of thing. It also helps to inform the community about the importance of open space and recreation in your community. So another thing that you should be aware of is if you have environmental justice neighborhoods in your community, you have to do enhanced outreach in those neighborhoods. Environmental justice, as you can see here, are particular areas that have been designated by census information. This is a way in which our office is trying to combat the environmental burdens that have been unduly placed on areas of low income and communities of color. So we expect that if there's an environmental justice designation for a particular neighborhood in your community, that you are going above and beyond trying to get those areas of your community involved in the public outreach. And if it's an enhanced outreach must take the form of advertising in the language spoken in that neighborhood if it is designated as EJ due to English isolation. There is an environmental justice data viewer that you can Google that is on our website, and that will tell you whether or not you have any EJ neighborhoods in your community. And my cursor is going to be somewhere on the computer. There it is. There are also mapping requirements. I'm not going to read these to you because they're listed there. That we expect in the plan. Again, the EJ map is only required if you have EJ communities or neighborhoods in your community. So a couple of other things that are very important is the open space inventory. This lists municipally owned conservation and recreation properties only. And this is a table with column headers that are listed here, the management agency, zoning, public access, blah, blah, blah. And essentially it's just a way for you to take an inventory of your existing conservation and recreation properties and the amenities that are currently available there, and also what could potentially be developed there, so that when you see through your survey what it is that people want, you then have the list of available spaces where those amenities could go. And then if there is something here that you've heard that your community members want, and then there's no available space for it, then you know in your action plan, one of your goals or objectives needs to be, hey, people say they really desperately want community gardens. We don't have any place to put them. We have to, in our action plan, identify a place to put a community garden. So that's the point of all that work of doing an open space inventory. Another important component is the action plan. This is where you take all of the feedback you've gotten and you come up with goals and objectives. And it also identifies a responsible party and a potential funding source for each of these goals and objectives. And it sets these goals out over a 7-year time window, so that you know the time frame under which you would like to accomplish these goals and objectives, and also who is kind of driving the bus on accomplishing these, and the ways financially that you think you could accomplish them. One of the other requirements is the Americans with Disabilities Act accessibility report. I'm not going to get too into this. It's a three-part requirement, but one of the things that we do require is that there is a checklist where you go to all the town-owned, city-owned conservation and recreation properties again, and use these facility inventory forms to see how accessible these properties are. And that should also become an action item in your action plan if you find that your conservation or recreation properties are not accessible. It should be a goal to make them accessible. Okay, so what is the approval process? You are like, thank goodness, I am done writing this freaking plan, and now Melissa gets to look at it. So you have written your plan, you submit, well, now in the world of COVID, you email me a copy of the plan. I take a look at it, I will read it, and then I send a letter back to the city or town saying, yay, you have conditional approval. And PS, you still need to do all these things before your plan receives final approval. And most plans, as long as you have written a 7-year action plan, the plan will expire 7 years to the month after you have received this conditional approval letter. And once you address all of the comments in the conditional approval letter, the plan receives a final approval letter, or the town or city receives a final approval letter, excuse me. And this is also if you get the letter, conditional approval letter from me, and you say, hey, I did talk about the geology in my community. It's on page 27. Well, you're welcome to call or email me and say, Melissa, the geology is on page 27. And I say, I'm sorry, I missed that. So you are correct. You don't need to worry about that. And again, where's the cursor? There it is. Okay, and so who can I call for help? So there's a whole list of useful resources in the workbook. You can call state agencies, regional planning agencies are great resources. You should also please call me. One of the things that happened at one of these types of workshops one time, not this open space workshop, but another one, was that I was the two co-panelists essentially spent the entire time getting mad at me for all of the things that they hated about the workbook. I mean, about the OSRP. And that did not seem like a constructive use of their time, nor the people in the audience. So what I would prefer you do is to call or email me and say, hey, Melissa, my town has absolutely nothing historic in it. So do we really need to include that in our plan? And I will say, well, is that really true? And then you say, yes, it really is. And I say, great, well, put in the scenic landscape section we looked and there's nothing historic in our town or city. And I say, great, fine, you don't need to do that section then. So we can have a dialogue of back and forth of what is completely not relevant to your community. I don't want to make this a huge burdensome thing for you to have to deal with if there are items in the workbook that you feel are completely irrelevant to your community. And I promise this is the last couple slides. So just quickly, some of the grant programs that are available once you have a plan approved from the office. The land and park grant are 2 municipal grant programs. The land grant to acquire land for conservation purposes, which I know Rebecca is going to, I think, be talking about next. Yep. And then the park grant is a municipal grant program for acquiring land for recreation purposes, as well as building a new park or renovating an existing park. Both of those grants should be posted very soon, sometime this month, with a mid-July deadline. We'll be having more Zoom workshops that I'm sure we're all excited about doing more of those, but we'll be hosting workshops on how to complete a successful application in May. The Land and Water Conservation Fund is a federal grant program that can do the same things that the Land and the Park grant can do. That grant just closed last month, so I don't know when the next grant round of that will be. The Small Communities Grant is a program to help communities with less than 6,000 residents write an open space and recreation plan or complete an appraisal, the catch being that you have to apply to one of these grants that we're talking about now. But that's good timing if you would like to apply for one of our grants and need an OSRP written or an appraisal completed. And there's a drinking water supply grant, which is quite obvious what the grant is for. It's to protect drinking water supply. Who would have guessed? And the landscape partnership grant is for protecting larger, at the larger landscape scale, 500 or more acres of land. Both the drinking water and landscape partnership grants are currently posted. So that information is also on our website. And the Conservation Partnership Grant is a grant program for nonprofits to acquire land. And oftentimes our land trusts are partners with communities when it comes to writing OSRPs as well. And they also are great partners with helping communities, a lot of times smaller communities, write their land grant applications. If you are a land trust person listening to me go on and on about OSRPs. And I am pretty certain, yes, that was going to be my last slide. So I will tell you right now, given my remote working situation, don't call me at that number because I'm not in Boston. So your best bet would be to email me at this email. And if we have something that, if you'd like to talk to me, which I understand some things are far easier to talk about over the phone, I am more than happy to set up a time to talk to you over the phone. But the best bet is to start with an email. And this website lists all of the many grant programs that we offer, including the 2 that are currently on the street, the Drinking Water Grant, Landscape Partnership Grant, and information on grant workshops. And then, like I said, the Land and the Park Grant should be posted sometime later this month with a mid-July deadline. And at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Right. Thank you, Melissa. Appreciate that. And if you do have any questions for Melissa about the open space and recreation plan process or anything else that she mentioned, feel free to enter those questions into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll have time to discuss those questions at the end of today's session. So next, our next speaker is going to be Rebecca Longval, who is the conservation agent in Bolton, Massachusetts. Rebecca recently helped complete a 43-acre land acquisition project in her town. It was a project that was prioritized by the town's open space and recreation plan and is providing valuable conservation and ecosystem services. Rebecca will be sharing more about how the town funded and acquired this parcel and share some tips for similar projects that you might be undertaking yourself. So Rebecca, I will hand it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. If you bear with me, I'm going to share my screen as well. Let's see. Okay. Can everybody see this and hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful, thank you. I would first like to say thank you to Melissa because I want to echo, you should definitely call her. She was a extremely valuable resource when I first started in my current position about 5 years ago when we did the update to our OSRP, and even still now with the land grant, I know she assists with the grant administrator on certain things or provides more supplemental information. Definitely call her. Don't hesitate if you have a question. She can at least guide you to who you should be talking to if she can't answer it herself. As Kate stated, I am going to really focus on our most recent acquisition project. I do want to just state a disclaimer that, and I feel it's necessary to clarify, we are still waiting to close. We are waiting just for the hard copies of our land grant project agreement, and then we'll be able to move forward with that. So hopefully within the next month or two, but I feel it's not complete until we do that. However, part of this project was kind of unique because we were in the middle of a pandemic. So, and I don't want to talk too much about the public outreach other than the components that I used that had to do with funding. And that was, we really looked to provide outreach related to what the major questions or concerns would be. And that was the financial implications to the town. So for everyone, I can't see the attendees, but I'm sure some of you are from municipalities, open space committees, nonprofits. So all of us, all groups that have limited resources. For instance, this property was listed for over $1 million. And I don't know of anyone who has that to spend. And if you do, wonderful. But in this particular circumstance, it was a property highlighted in our open space and recreation plan. It was currently in chapter land. So one question that may come up, which I know Christina will touch upon, is implementing and right of first refusal. And the reason why we didn't wait until that point when the right of first refusal came about is because my next slide, which shows a conceptual subdivision plan was submitted to the town, just informally discussing with the planning board the potential for this property to be developed. So right there, you have two items that basically defend to the town why this is important to prioritize now versus waiting. So what am my next slide? Another reason was in 2012, actually in the 2005 open space and recreation plan, it was explicitly highlighted. Then in 2012, they reached out to the property owner, tried to conserve it at that time with some limited development, and it didn't work out. So therefore, we brought it up again and shared that there was a significant wildlife corridor that it contributed to, and listed the reasons in the open space and recreation plan as well. Again, one of the major concerns was the financial component of it. So how we had to understand that not only would the municipal staff, or also the commissions who have the choice and the decisions to make in approving the budget to go to town meeting and approving articles, to ensure that it's not going to negatively impact the town. Excuse me. So what we did was we went to the Conservation Commission. I work for the Conservation Commission. So regularly we talked about it at town meeting. We went into the project and suggesting it to the Board of Selectmen with the clear, transparent action that we would be actively applying for grants. So for this project, we looked at the small communities grant that Melissa mentioned because it needed to have an appraisal done. We ended up receiving that grant. So that was, and excuse me, let me back up. We have a conservation fund for the use of land acquisition. It's restricted within our town for what we can use it for. So it's a pool of funds that sit there year after year. And it's a bit of a discussion every year to explain why that needs to sit there and build funds instead of using it. And that's for when these projects come up, we would like to have the opportunity to have a pool of funds to use and make a real strong offer contribution to conserving the land. So what we ended up doing is we paid for the appraisal out of that conservation fund. Then we applied for the Small Communities Grant, and then we're reimbursed the amount that we spent. So that went back into that conservation fund. Our Conservation Commission authorized the use of that conservation fund for the purchase of the property and the acquisition related costs. So when we went to town meeting with the article, we had actually already spoken many times with the property owner and the Board of Selectmen to work out a price that was not $1 million. The total cost was about, I'm going to skip to the next slide. Total cost, purchase cost would be $550,000 for the town. And the reason why the property owner was really interested in working with the town on the price is because it would go to town use. And her family had a history in the town. Her father, who really was the individual who had the best relationship in the town. This is where he came for summers and ended up staying for quite some time and obviously acquiring land. So she was more willing to work with the town than to have the town purchase it and then sell it off to a developer, say, for an example. So we were able to discuss that it would stay within town use. The majority of the 43 acres would be conserved, and we would be applying for a land grant. So again, back to what Melissa was saying, the Small Communities Grant requires you to apply for a land grant, or that's one of the qualifying parameters, land or park grant. So we were able to, again, ensure the property owner that this in fact was going to be the use. We were true to our word, we remained transparent. Again, back to financial implications and limited resources. The total acquisition cost is $550,000. So I went into the Board of Selectmen meeting with the grants that I felt we were most competitive for, or could apply and be relatively competitive. So we looked at the community forest because it's already in chapter, so it has a long-term forest management plan. We looked at the MAPC Accelerating Climate Resiliency Grant, and then we looked at the land grant. And of course, we applied for the land grant. We did receive it, so that lowered the cost. We also were allowed to, we did not unfortunately receive the MAPC Accelerating Climate Resiliency Grant. And we ended up not making the timeline for the community forest grant. However, with just the conservation fund that I was talking about before, which was about $32,000, and the land grant we received, which is $308,000, we were able to lower the total acquisition cost to $210,000. So that's essentially cutting it in half, we'll say, to generalize. But going into town meeting, we shared this slide and we provided this as part of our public outreach months before the town meeting. And it shows the biggest concern, which is the cost of the acquisition. I worked with our town accountant, treasurer, and tax collector to figure out in tax revenue by purchasing this property, what would be lost. And it was about, I don't know, the cost of 2 large pizzas, we'll say, depending on where you get your pizza from, over about 20 years. And it would equate to about $3 to $4 per $100,000 of value per year. So that allowed in one slide to present to the public what exactly they were taking on in their taxes. What we also looked at was the cost of community services. Now, I think this group in particular will understand that with increased residents or residential development, You may have increased children. So you may have increased cost for school systems or public safety and other things that relate back to more people, more services. So by conserving this property, it does reduce the cost of community services, even though what we just talked about, there's a little bit of an increase in your taxes, your property taxes. It still allows for a little bit of a balance and allowed for individuals to see, we can publicly access this property. We'll be able to do the long-term forest management plan on this property, so see benefits from that as well, along with the current administration's focus, which is climate resiliency and climate adaptation. And we focused highlighting some of those aspects as well, and to provide to the public the information to ensure that they could make a well-informed decision versus getting to town meeting and having people stand up, not know what the financial implications would be. We did, as you heard, we did apply to multiple grants and we didn't get them all. But going into it, I think knowing the grants and looking at, typically the grants come with a scorecard, I'll say to be general, looking at that and seriously understanding whether or not your project applies, and then reaching out to the grant administrators or the individuals, the organization sponsoring the grant, to ask questions if you feel that it's right on the line regarding if it really truly meets one of their items. So for instance, this property does not allow for hunting because within the town of Bolton, we don't allow hunting on public properties. However, it did check off a lot of those other boxes and provide a valuable resource to the community. And as you'll see in the map to the right of your screen, that it actually adds to that wildlife corridor I mentioned when I first started this presentation. So there were a lot of other significant items that played in, even though we didn't meet every single scorecard item or rank highly on every single scorecard. So it does balance out. At the end of the day, again, we are still working to close on the property, but everyone is more than excited to get this going, put some trails in, have a ribbon cutting ceremony. But it was definitely a learning experience. And Melissa was talking about public outreach and not getting too into the water about the public outreach during the pandemic. And I would agree with her because you can talk a lot about that, and I'll answer some questions at the end. But I do want to remind people, just as she was saying, is it was possible and we did it. We did a lot of, email blasts. We did a lot of featuring things on the town website. We did a lot of outreach with our Bolton Access Cable Television was nice enough to feature a tour of the property. So we walked on the property, described the history of it. We described that it was at risk for development, why that was the case, the species that were there, the fact that there's a vernal pool in the center of it. And it really allowed people to not only share it, but also be a little bit more focused on the information we were sharing, where at times, I think when you hold events, you either get a lot of people or you get no one. So in a sense, I think the pandemic for this particular property may have actually helped us out. But it was worth it to apply for the multiple grants, even though we didn't hear back from all of them. And I would definitely encourage using information like the slide I provided, because we had a lot of positive feedback. And although you can't change everyone's mind, it provided the information we needed to at least address the questions for people who were most concerned or most, I wouldn't necessarily say against it, but most concerned, I guess. So thank you. I know that was a lot of information and I talked in a circle a little bit, but I hope that was helpful for you.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. If you have any questions for Rebecca about anything that she was talking about, again, just feel free to put them in the Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen, and we'll ask those live after all three of our speakers have gone. All right, so our final speaker today is Christina Madsen, who is a Keystone Cooperator in Southampton, Massachusetts. Christina is an active volunteer for open space in her community. She has worked with land trusts, municipal boards, and other local volunteers to advocate for and protect local space throughout her town. Today, Christina will be sharing her story of using the right of first refusal, which gives towns an option to purchase certain land at risk of development in her hometown of Southampton. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Christina.
Thank you, Kate. I'm pleased to be here. And so indeed, I'm going to talk about land acquisition through the Chapter 61 right of first refusal option. And for those, just to make sure that everyone is aware of the right of first refusal option, I'm going to start by saying that in the Chapter 61 regulations, there is a clause for the municipal option to purchase. And it reads, in part, I understand that the city or town has an option to purchase any classified land whenever I plan to sell it for or convert it to a residential, commercial, or industrial use during a fiscal year it is classified. And further down, I understand that I may not sell or convert the land until at least 120 days after I provide a notice that fully complies with the requirements of Chapter 61, or until I have been notified in writing that the option will not be exercised. And then it goes on. So my experience with the right of first refusal was concentrated in a 2-year period beginning in late 2017, when 3 chapter parcels, which were all part of one estate, were put on the market in Southampton. On the College Highway, there was a 50-acre parcel zoned part residential, part commercial, which was land that the town had sought to purchase in the past and was again actively considering as a site for a new public safety complex. There was also an 85-acre woodlot in one of only 4 areas that the 2013 Southampton Master Plan identifies as an open space protection area. And then there was a 33-acre woodlot that was being marketed at 17 acres, abutting Wolf Hill Sanctuary. The town was not notified by the sellers of the intent to sell, despite all 3 parcels being promoted for their development potential. This is how the listings for each began. For the 50 acres, tremendous opportunities exist for this commercial residentially zoned property. For the 85 acres, ideal for large single-family lots. And then for the 33 acres, potential for multiple building lots in beautiful Southampton. By the time they were listed, all 3 parcels were under contract with different developers. The worst of it was that the 50-acre parcel that the town was hoping to have the opportunity to buy for the public safety complex was under contract with the brother and business partner of one of the select board members. This outrage prompted a small group of townswomen to band together to insist that the Southampton Select Board pay attention to chapter regulations. Being an urgent and complex situation, we met every weekend throughout the winter, determined to make a case for pursuing right of first refusal so strong that the select board couldn't ignore it. All 3 parcels were important for the town to consider, but we were particularly focused on the College Highway parcel because of what we perceived to be a serious conflict of interest. To make a very long and complex story short, the town never received a notice of intent from either the seller or the buyer, and the now owner is proceeding exactly as we anticipated. Despite a commercial loan, a public offer to the town to donate a few acres for a public safety complex, that offer was later rescinded, and other substantial evidence of his intent to develop that land, he re-enrolled the acreage in Chapter 61, removed it after 1 year, and come May of this year, he'll be able to move forward with his development scheme without triggering the town's right of first refusal option. The town has been deprived of one of its most valuable potential assets. One of our group's major hurdles was our town council's unswerving opinion that intent to convert means shovel in the ground, that a town can only intervene when actual conversion has begun. The attorney who was assisting us maintained that if a town can prove that a developer has concealed his intent, he can be held accountable. Kate, would you please give me the next slide? Thanks. This opinion is supported by this 2003 Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court case, Town of Sudbury versus Scott, wherein developer Scott pursued the same course as the Southampton developer, and Sudbury sued. The Supreme Judicial Court found in Sudbury's favor, and the case was remanded to the lower court. So I'm going to read just one short excerpt to illustrate the value of this document. It says, under the statute, which is Mass General Law 61A, Section 14, the town's option to purchase is triggered by notice, not by an actual change of use, and notice must precede the sale or change of use. The statute refers to a specific intent and a specific point in time. The critical date is the date of sale, and the critical intent is the intent to discontinue the agricultural use of the land on acquiring title. Now, this was a case of Chapter 61A, so that's agricultural, the agricultural program. In most cases, if not disclosed before sale, the intent to convert will become evident soon after sale when the new owner begins a process of conversion. However, there may be instances where the new owner will continue the agricultural use for a brief period after sale to conceal his true purpose, with the intent to defeat the town's right of first refusal. A town that can establish such intent as of the date of the sale and a failure to give notice is entitled to specific performance of its option to purchase. The legislative history supports our conclusion. So for any towns that find themselves facing a similar situation, I urge you to read this transcript. It's really valuable. And unfortunately for Southampton, due to town council's differing opinion in that regard, and the fact that 3 of 4 select board members were in league with the developer, our select board refused to sue. So spurred, I believe, by this controversy over the 50-acre parcel, the town received a notice of intent from the buyer of the 85-acre woodlot, and that was on April 10th, 2018. The town would have 120 days, or until the first week in August, to round up $720 and exercise the right. Now, unlike the town of Bolton, the town of Southampton, does not have a conservation fund. So we had no monies available with which to pursue this purchase other than Community Preservation Act funds. As impossible as it sounded, there was no question that we were going to dig in and take it as far as we could. Although the matter was now officially in the town's hands, our group started brainstorming to find a way to make it happen. We realized immediately that a grant was our only hope, but you can't get a grant in 4 months. One member of our group, who was an experienced grant writer, began researching possibilities and consulting with Mark Walmsley from Kestrel Land Trust, who, by the way, had been assisting us since the minute the lands were put on the market. The land grant looked like a real possibility, but the deadline was July 12th. So our thinking was, if we were to apply for the grant, maybe the seller would extend the deadline, which is allowed in chapter regulations. And Kate, would you proceed to the next image? By this time, our group had made a concerted effort to make residents aware of the sale of these lands. There had been numerous newspaper articles, and 2 select board members had hosted a public forum, and Kate, I'd like the next one on that as well. So they had hosted a public forum, quote, to educate townspeople about chapter lands and to gauge interest in the town's securing open space, unquote. Residents' interest was high, and 175 people attended the forum, which is more than attend an annual town meeting. In mid-May, the select board established the ad hoc open space review committee to formally undertake the process of exercising right of first refusal. It was comprised of 2 select board members, they who had hosted the chapter forum, reps from the Board of Assessors, Planning Board, Community Preservation Committee, and CONCOM, plus 2 members at large. Mark Walmsley was their advisor. Their stated goals were, quote, in the short term, to develop a strategy to secure funding for the purchase of 111 Glendale Road, unquote. Their long-term goal was to identify via the master plan and other means desirable / priority land for the town to own, and to proactively approach landowners to inquire about their long-term plans for the land. And this ad hoc committee has since become a permanent open space committee in Southampton. So there were 2 groups working on this, the official and the unofficial, with some overlap. By the time the review committee was formed in mid-May, only 2.5 months remained before the right of first refusal deadline. This is a list, probably incomplete, of what had to be accomplished. To find $720,000, $36,000 of which would be due as a deposit in early August when the option was exercised. There would also be about $60,000 worth of associated costs, which would include appraisal, legal fees, a conservation restriction if CPA monies were to be used, and the land trust fees. That was number 1. 2 was to contact the seller to see if an extension would be considered. 3, get an appraisal and first estimates. The appraisal was required for the land grant. For right of first refusal, the bona fide offer would establish the price that the town would have to match. And I believe that for the grant, the appraisal had to match or exceed the purchase price. We needed to hire a new lawyer. It was quickly agreed that the town needed a local conservation lawyer to shepherd this process, someone other than town council. And how could that be funded? Not from annual legal counsel budget. So it was eventually decided to request it to be taken from the Finance Committee reserve funds. Kate, next slide, please. We had to hold a public hearing and then schedule a special town meeting for voters to approve or not approve purchase. Timing was critical for every step. The review committee was meeting every week. Our group was meeting every week. Requests immediately went to the Community Preservation Committee for monies to cover the cost of the appraisal and for the $36,000 deposit. They were both approved. Our grant writer, Diana, and Mark were working away on the grant application. Documents for that included cover letter written by the town administrator, who was also responsible for soliciting quotes and overseeing the appraisal. The narrative describing the land and the attributes that made it worthy for protection, and that was Diana's domain. The draft conservation restriction and the maps were being handled by Kestrel. All these things were being done without our knowledge as to whether the sellers would grant an extension. Over time, it came to pass that they would not agree to one before knowing the outcome of the special town meeting. They wanted full assurance that the town could and would purchase it before they would consider negotiating a payment plan. As complex as this process was, there was a determined effort on the part of many people, spearheaded by Select Board member Renee Groden, to acquire this land and begin to change the course of the uncontrolled development history of Southampton. For the town to make the purchase, 2 articles had to be drafted for the special town meeting warrant. One to approve CPA funds, the expenditure of which would be contingent on securing the land grant. And then the second, asking voters to approve the entire purchase in the event that we were not awarded the land grant. So to get to town meeting, the Community Preservation Committee had to first approve these expenditures, which they did, but just barely. If we were to not get the grant and have to use only town monies for the purchase, we would have had to have borrowed the amount of the grant, $400,000, against future CPA charges, surcharges, and the Community Preservation Committee was quite reluctant to think about doing that, but they, in the end, decided to let the voters decide. Obviously, we needed to rally more public support, so postcards were again printed for handout at the transfer station and other places. Calls were made and emails sent. We anticipated a fair amount of opposition, so we worked hard. Turnout exceeded expectations and Article 1 passed, 198 in favor, 11 opposed. Article 2 also passed, 198 in favor, 11 opposed. So right of first refusal was exercised and the sellers agreed to delay the closing until the end of February. And next slide, please. On January 23rd, the town was notified that the land grant had been awarded to us. To receive the grant, the town had to fulfill other time-constrained requirements, including signs and a parking lot. It took great unity and an untiring commitment to bring this acquisition to pass. Given the uncertainties of so many aspects of the process, it was almost a miracle. And we're very proud of the Clearwater Conservation Area. Since then, a nearby 9-acre parcel has been donated to the town, and we hope that this conservation area will eventually grow larger. So briefly, the 33-acre parcel that abuts the Wolf Hill Sanctuary, and this was the third parcel that had gone on the market, that would have been the easiest for the town to pursue because the price of $280,000 would have been gotten directly from CBA funds. That buyer found 4 perk sites, but he has re-enrolled it in chapter for now. Another loss due to the select board's unwillingness to fight for right of first refusal. I have one more example to offer. Just as the acquisition of the 85 acres was nearing its close, another chapter parcel was put on the market. 15 acres was being carved out of a 75-acre tract to be sold for development. This property was of particular interest to me because it abuts the family land that my sister and I now own, and I had approached the former owner, now deceased, several years ago to see if he might be willing to conserve it. Arrangements had already been made. He had willed it to a neighbor. Knowing that the land had some hydrogeologic significance, I immediately approached the Southampton Water Commission to inform them of the imminent sale and to learn if they indeed did consider it an important parcel. One of the commission members was very familiar with this area, which in a 1987 hydrogeologic study had been determined to lie within the primary recharge area of our municipal well. And this commissioner was to become our strongest advocate for the acquisition. It was a small, expensive, but important parcel. So I proposed to the commission that if they would pursue those 15 acres, my sister and I would put a conservation restriction on our 80 acres, thereby creating a conserved tract of roughly 90 acres. Standing alone, the 15 acres would have seemed insignificant, but with our added acres, which we still own, this conservation of land to protect our only town well gained support. The owner was relatively cooperative and flexible in working with the town administrator, and with the award of another hastily applied for grant, this time a water supply protection grant, the town also now owns this property through right of first refusal. My sister and I have been notified that we will receive a 2022 conservation land tax credit, so our conservation restriction will be finalized when that becomes available. This project illustrates that creating large tracts from a union of smaller ones can be an effective conservation strategy. So in addition to all of the Southampton residents who put their minds, hearts, and time into protecting these lands from development, the Keystone Network provided invaluable support and guidance. I'd like to give a special shout out to Paul Catanzaro from UMass, Sarah Wells from Mount Grace, and most especially to Mark Walmsley, who stood by us when the odds seemed to be completely against us. So thank you. And I have a few closing thoughts. Since saving open space is a growing concern for all towns, right of first refusal should be one effective tool for doing so. And it certainly is in a limited way. In my opinion, as the regulations now stand, the Chapter 61 program is very beneficial to landowners, and certainly for people who love their land, makes it possible for them to be spared from selling it due to an overburdensome tax load. But for towns which have offered tax relief for extended periods of time, the benefits due them are difficult and cumbersome to achieve. Difficult primarily because of time limitations. I would like to think that over time, the regulations would be modified to give towns more time to negotiate a purchase and arrange for funding, and to make it much more difficult for developers to manipulate the regulations to their ends. For now, however, lawyers and foresters alike have cautioned that Chapter 61 is a tax relief, not a conservation program. As one lawyer put it, don't hang your hat on 61. Despite the cautions, Southampton did hang its hat on 61, and we are the richer for it. Because the exercising of right of first refusal is so complex and the timing so impossibly tight, a good first step would be for towns to review and prioritize chapter lands and encourage landowners to consider working with the town if and when they choose to relinquish ownership. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. Really appreciate that. All right. So we're going to move now into answering some of the questions that have come in through chat. And just a reminder to everybody who's on today that we will be sharing any of the links and all of the resources that speakers have been referencing in an email after this session. So you will have access to those. Don't worry, they won't disappear.
And I just want to make a quick interruption to say, Kate, that I got to do the site visit for the land grant application that Christina spoke so well about. And it's a beautiful property, and it's great when the grant timing can work for a Chapter 61 project. But Christina is right that it's not always that the timing it works.
And we thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Great. All right. Well, I'm going to start with a few questions that we've received from the audience. And if you do have one that comes up, feel free to put it in the Q&A function. And we have a good 20 minutes for questions. So hopefully we should be able to get to yours. So the first question I think is for you, Melissa. Somebody has asked if you could give some examples of some state funding sources that are available to help pay for preparing an open space and recreation plan.
Well, I mentioned one already, the Small Communities Grant, which is available for communities with less than 6,000 in population, and Rebecca also mentioned it in her presentation. And that's a pretty simple, like 2-page form that you fill out, and it's available now, rolling applications, and it's 80% reimbursement rate up to, I can't remember what this year's grant maximum is. Obviously, that doesn't work for all communities. There is a planning grant that EEA also offers that can pay for open space and recreation plans as well. And I think the Division of Local and Technical Assistance can also pay for OSRPs. And then if those are the only state funding that I'm available, but I also know that RPAs, if you're looking for help, are a great bargain. They do really amazing work, and they don't charge nearly as much as a consulting firm does. But like I said, you really can do this work with in-house. And given that I have to write the statewide open space and recreation plan for the entire Commonwealth, and it's just me writing it for the entire state, I have the full faith that somebody on this Zoom can do it for your community. And also, like I said,
Absolutely.
all of you have questions, or I should say email, and then I'm happy to help through the process.
Absolutely. And actually one of the case studies on the website too actually features 3 open space committees who wrote their open space and recreation plans as entirely volunteer committees. So also check that out too if that is a situation that applies to you. Thank you. Our next question that was asked, this was answered in chat, but I do just want to share it so that people can see it. John asked, is there a place that I can find all properties in my town that fall under 61A? And Rebecca, I saw that you answered that, but I was wondering if you could just repeat that so everybody can hear.
Sure. And I actually want to add something quickly to it as well. What I stated in the Q&A chat is you can contact your town assessor. They should be able to provide that information for you if they don't have it readily available. Typically, though, I would also encourage you to look on Mass Oliver because that information may be there as well. What you want to do on Mass Oliver, it's online GIS for free. And you want to look at the tab of open space and looking at by ownership. So that will highlight it a different color depending on who owns it or what category it falls under.
Great, thank you. Yes, and Mass Oliver is a great tool.
Yeah.
Oh, did you want to add something, Melissa?
Nope.
Oh, okay. All right. So the next question is from David, who asks, could speakers talk a little bit more about the role of the Community Preservation Committee in leveraging grant funds or facilitating a right of first refusal? And Christina, I know you touched on that a little bit. Would you like to start with that?
Yes, so just say again, he would like to know how to access community preservation funds.
Yeah, so the question was, could you speak a little bit to the role of the Community Preservation Committee in leveraging grant funds or facilitating exercising a right of first refusal?
Well, there's a designated amount of funds, a proportion of funds in the Community Preservation Act funding for open space. And so that is available for the acquisition of open space, and any proposal would have to go before the committee to make a decision as to whether they wanted to vote to expend the funds to be used for that particular parcel of land. Now, as to exercising the right of first refusal, for our town, who has no conservation fund or no specific store of money to act quickly, because as I've just made clear, the right of first refusal has to move unbelievably fast. The CPA funds are about the only place, they are the only place from which we could have requested funds in Southampton. So they were the logical place to go. And there is in the CPA funds, there are also, aside from 3 designated areas of historic, housing, and open space, there's the general fund that can be drawn from. So we requested from the open space and general fund.
Excellent, thank you. All right, our next question, Karen is asking, and I think this question is for you, Rebecca. We are in the early stages of setting up a conservation fund. Do you have any advice on how to do that?
That's a tough question. I don't, other than really look into under Mass General Law. Now I'm going to forget it. I think it's Chapter 40, Section 8C. Basically what establishes a conservation commission. It should also include language regarding that you're able to establish a conservation fund and the parameters that you can use it more generally. Our town, as I stated, decided to restrict that further some time ago and restrict it to land acquisition projects. So I would really weigh out what your goal is for that fund. I saw someone comment on it that they use it for staff salary as well, or staff pay. And I think that's another use that's allowed under it. But really understanding the purpose of that fund from the beginning, instead of later on having a battle of what it can or cannot be used for, would be helpful. And making sure, I think transparency is key whenever you're creating a new fund or going to start something new, and really so that everyone understands, particularly in a town where you're creating a new fund, talk to your accountant, talk to your treasurer, and make sure that you do have the parameters to do it fairly easily, and also what the implications may be moving forward, or what hurdles you may have to get over, and therefore provide the information to remain transparent throughout. So it's very easy or easier to overcome the hurdles versus keeping all the information to yourself or the Conservation Commission and then having a very long detailed conversation that may end in an argument later on.
Great. Yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice. Keep that transparency open and make sure that that is communicated from the beginning. Thank you. All right. Our next question is from Andrea, who says, even though our town has had plans such as an open space and recreation plan, it appears that there have been decisions in the past that were made irrespective of the plans. Are there any best practices for keeping the open space and recreation plan front and center for all planning, building, and development? Melissa, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I would say that from the beginning, to make sure that the committee writing the plan is as broad as possible, the committee membership, so that it's not just conservation minded people or recreation minded people. And when I say that, I mean, sometimes I see plans that it's obvious that it was written just by people who are into open space, or just those people who are into recreation. And so mix those two groups first of all, but then also make sure that you're involving like the building inspector from your community or the planning office. And so you get all viewpoints. You don't want just the people who are tree huggers, for lack of a better term. You want to make sure that you have the people who really are development minded in your community too, because it's not just about what is protected, it's about what's left in your community to develop, because we do need more affordable housing, and sometimes there needs to be other types of development in the community. So that's the best way to start, is to have a diverse committee, but then also when you are done with the plan, to really give a good thought as to who is implementing the plan. And that's why the action plan should be reasonable. On some occasions, I get an action plan that is like 20 pages long, and I'll say, are you guys really, are you really going to be able to do all this? Because the worst thing that will happen is, say it's like 3 years into this plan and you've accomplished 1 page of your 25-page plan. That just makes you feel so sad, so it's best to make sure you're coming up with a doable list so that people feel really excited to keep it going over the 7 years.
May I just add to that in Southampton, many plans, the open space recreation plan, the master plan, and many others have been shelved over the years. It's easy to get them done, but much harder to implement them. And it really takes vigilance. And with our master plan, it was developed in 2013. There was a short period of implementation, and then that just dissolved because it was cumbersome. It was there was a huge scope within it. And then it was only within the past 3 years, I think, that has been reinstated, and we're working on it again. And we've just done an updated open space and recreation plan, but and now our open space committee is really paying attention to that. But that too was a big plan that had a lot invested in it, but it sat on the shelf for a long time. So it really takes a determined group of people to keep it out and active.
I'd like just to make one small suggestion. Suggestion is to tie that open space and recreation plan into everything that applies, conversation-wise. So if you're at a planning board meeting, you're at a conservation commission meeting, board of selectmen, hey, remember this plan that we spent a lot of time, we sent it to the state, to Melissa's office. She did a great job reviewing it. She sent it back. We got our final approval. We're trying to do something with it. Here's how it applies to what we're doing now. Don't forget about it. And it's very easy to do that as long as you've done it well, and all of them are done well because they have such great review at the end. But I think that's important as well, making sure it's woven into the current events.
Absolutely. And one of our attendees, Amy, also commented in the chat that their town set up a standing committee to include appointed members from the Planning Board, the Conservation Commission, the City Council, as well as citizen members. And it has really helped with keeping their plan real and actionable, she said. And I believe that is from Amesbury. Excellent. Okay. So let's see. Our next question is from Alan, who says that in Rentham, we have found that tax revenues from new housing sometimes do not even cover the educational costs from the town. Could you speak to tax and cost information if the parcel had been sold to a developer? And I think that was directed at you, Rebecca.
Sure. I can't really answer that question directly. What we actually carried out, I'll call it a study. I believe UMass Amherst graduate student Paul Catanzaro, though, shared it with me because I am also a Keystone cooperator, on cost of community services. So I thought it would be important to just get an understanding of what the implications are. So I worked with our assessors and pulled the information in, ran the study, and came out with some differences, but I don't have it for that exact parcel, I guess. So I can't properly answer your question, but I would encourage you to do that study or have someone on your town staff just even run it generally.
I think for that study, what was generally found, or for the results of that study, were that for new development, for every tax dollar that was taken in, it was about $1.14 or something like that, in cost to the town for new development. And the costs of maintaining open space were by far less.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. So the next question is from Danielle, and Christina, I think this question is for you. Danielle asks, with the right of first refusal, was there a limit to the asking price, or did this have to be a fair market value?
The town could only pay the appraisal price. Let me just refer back. Let's see. The grant, we could not pay more than the appraised price for to exercise the right of first refusal.
Excellent, thank you. Okay. So Melissa, this next question I believe is for you. Bruce asks, is there any reason an open space and recreation plan can't be updated prior to the expiration of that 7-year timeline?
Nope, I just, whatever, people ask me that somewhat regularly, actually, and I just don't, there's not an appetite for it most of the time, because it's kind of like all the work. I don't see why most communities would want to go through all that effort prior to the 7 years. Sometimes I hear from communities that there's been some major change, so they want to do it again. And of course, it's totally fine. But I just make it clear that the 7 years is from that date that they are getting that conditional approval letter. It's not, say if they submitted today, but the plan doesn't expire until 2023, it's not like the new expiration date is 2030, it would be 2028.
That was a good question. I was curious about that as well.
So if you want to update it every 2 years, go ahead.
Go crazy.
Whatever. Whatever works best for you. Excellent.
Exactly.
Thank you. Okay. So our next question is around, again, community engagement. So an attendee has asked, how would you recommend leveraging engagement when you don't have a permanent open space committee? Maybe you don't have a particularly active conservation committee and you don't have many town staff. So I think each of you did touch on community engagement a little bit. So maybe we can go around and share some practices that have worked for you in getting the word out to your community.
Yeah, I will just jump in and say that when I had to do the statewide open space and recreation plan, what I found works well, because sadly, I'm sure everybody can relate to this, that people don't really come out for public meetings unless there's something that they want to yell at you about, or there's something that they're like really jazzed about. And so when you're some nameless state bureaucrat coming to, Worcester to talk about this plan that they've never heard of, they're not going to come out. So, and I don't blame them. People are busy, so it's like, why would you come out to this unnamed meeting? So what we have found is a really good tool is to piggyback onto existing meetings. So instead of just showing up in Worcester one night, is to, like, if the Greater Worcester Land Trust is already having their annual meeting, I would call Colin Novick, who's the executive director, and say, hey, Colin, can I get time on your agenda to speak about this? And that also helps build credibility with what you're doing. Because if Colin signs off on Melissa Cryan, then his membership is going to trust what it is that I'm doing. And that especially is useful too when it comes to working in environmental justice communities too, we have found. So that would be my biggest suggestion, is to kind of tag team, and then you're not reinventing the wheel, because one of the other things that I have found becomes kind of a part-time job when you're trying to do public meetings is finding free space, which maybe when you work for a municipality isn't as big of a problem, but it's hard to find space that's free and available when you need it.
One tool that we found very effective in making people aware, and now granted our situation was quite controversial, but we printed up postcards, and then we went to the town transfer station and handed them out, and we really made an active effort. This group of about 8 women was very determined and spent a lot of time making sure that the community was aware of what was going on. So those postcards were great, and posters and emails. Whenever an important vote, there was an important vote, emails would go out to those people we knew would support us, and we'd rally them to come to town meeting. And it was really amazingly effective. I think that what we found was that people are really wanting to be engaged and willing to be engaged, but they need to be made aware of things and made to feel like their input really matters. So really just reaching out and those postcards were remarkable. We sent out 3 or 4 over the course of that chapter, the right of first refusal period.
Thank you.
I think all those suggestions were great. I think one of the things that through the Keystone Cooperative training is sort of engraved into our minds is it's in the network, and that statement. And it's true, I think, for both what Melissa stated and Christina stated, and what I would echo from what they said, but also thinking outside the box a little bit and really finding out, or even just as you're sharing information or talking to individuals, whether it be at the local coffee shop in your town, where you may not have staff directly involved, and it may be sort of a citizen group initiating it. I think it's helpful to just start spreading the word and then asking for who you should contact, or reaching out like we did to Bolton Access Cable Television and saying, would you be interested in featuring this? And it's a little outside the box, but it helps. And definitely the postcards helped with us as well. We reached out to our local trust. So finding out who may have an interest and then reaching out to them.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
And two, just a reminder that actually in the final week of this conference, so the last Thursday of March, we'll be spending the full hour that week talking about community engagement and sharing suggestions from several open space committee members who will also have more input on that topic as well. So make sure to check out week 4. All right, so we are right at the end of our time together, unfortunately. So I do want to stop there just to respect everybody's time. But first, huge thank you to all of our panelists today for sharing your experience with open space and your expertise. Really appreciate it and everything you were able to, all the knowledge you were able to bring to us today. Just so everybody knows too, if you attended today, we are of course having the annual open space raffle. So if you attended today, you have automatically been entered. So check your email to see if you are a winner. If you'd like to keep the conversation going, we'll be having a networking session tonight from 7 to 8 p.m. where you'll actually get a chance to talk to other attendees, meet additional people. If you'd like to join that, you can find the link for that in the same email that you used to join this afternoon. And then we hope you join us again next week for our second session for the Open Space Conference, which is protecting and building resilience in local green spaces. So again, thank you so much for attending today. We will send out all of the links that we shared in the chat. We'll send out answers to any of the Q&A questions that we weren't able to get to. And make sure you check your email for that, and it will also be posted on the website. So thank you again to all of our attendees. We hope you have a great day, and we hope to see you at some of our future sessions. So thank you, everyone. And thank you again, Melissa, Rebecca, and Christina. We really appreciate it.
Thank you as well.
Thank you. Yes.